showers in the southeast. Well, the government is preparing to hold its first repeal day, setting aside a day of parliamentary proceedings to axe legislation it says is hurting productivity and clogging business. The man tasked with cutting red tape under the Abbott government is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, and I spoke with him just a short time ago. So how much of what you've announced today is cutting active regulations rather than just redundant legislation of one sort or another?
Well, Peter, one of the key reforms that has been made public today is the changes to the Personal Property Security Act, and that looks at companies, particularly hire firms, that have to register goods that they lease out for more than 90 days with a Commonwealth body. Now, these companies pay about $8 for a registration. There's a huge amount of paperwork involved, and we've said that companies will only need to register goods if they're going to now lend them for more than 1 year. So that's a very practical change.
I'm sure that that's the case, and I'm sure that that's welcomed as an example, and I'm sure you've got many more examples like it. But you must know, in rough percentage terms, how much of what's happened is redundant removals versus active regulation.
Well, they're two very different issues. There is the 9,000 redundant regulations, which will be tabled in the Parliament on Wednesday, and that's things where legislation makes prescription for payment in pennies and pounds, for example, and clearly, you know, those no longer need to be on the statute books. But there's also...
Labor did some of that as well. They removed redundant legislation. The real important one in a reforming sense is obviously the active side of it. So we'll put those 9,000 to one side.
Absolutely.
How many are active pieces of regulations that have been removed?
Well, there are many, and I can list a few for you. For example...
But is it in the dozens, or is it in the hundreds or thousands?
Oh, well, look, you're going to see most of it on Wednesday, but there's already a number of significant deregulation initiatives which will automatically lift the burden on small business and on families and on education facilities. Take, for example, job service providers. You know, they have been required to keep paper copies of job applications to them, and in one case a job service provider kept 336 cabinets full of regulations. We've now said you do not need to keep these applications if you can store them electronically. I want
to go through these sort of examples, but I do just want to get a sense of how much we're talking about here, because a lot has been made about the need to cut red tape.
Sure.
I mean, thousands, yes, in terms of redundant pieces of regulation, and that's great. That's got to go. But what are we talking in terms of active? Is it hundreds? Is it that much?
Let's put it in number terms. It's hundreds of millions of dollars in reduced compliance costs from announcements that we've already made which have a deregulatory impact. Now, that can include something like the carbon tax, because there's a regulatory impact statement which is now published publicly on the Office of Best Practice Regulations website, which details $85 million in compliance costs that will be removed from businesses, from families, as a result of repealing the carbon tax. So we've already announced that. The case I gave you in terms of job service providers, that has already been done administratively, so you don't need regulation to pass that. So there's a whole series of measures that we have announced already, which total hundreds of millions of dollars, Peter, in terms of savings for the community.
And how are you going to enforce this? Because the booklet released today looked very similar to the policy that was taken to the election. What are the enforceability measures so that when we sit down in 12 or 18 months' time, you will have achieved what you're setting out to achieve today?
Well, where it's legislative change that is required, obviously we do need the support of the Senate, and that's going to be easier on the more controversial elements of our deregulation agenda after, July 1. In terms of other areas, well, where you can do it administratively and you can change policies or requirements that are imposed by the departments, you can do that automatically. And I'll give you one practical example. The Brotherhood of St Lawrence is now only going to have to report quarterly to the Department of Education in the administration of a major education program instead of on a monthly basis, and that can save the Brotherhood of St Lawrence up to $500,000 a year. That will just be done now as a matter of course and won't need to be enforced by any external organisation.
Are you also going to change something like company tax? I mean, the previous government changed it to monthly, didn't they, when it had previously been quarterly. Is that something that's going to be adjusted, do you know?
Well, look, the overall tax burden, the overall tax system is going to be the subject of a white paper, Peter, and as the Prime Minister said in the press conference today when someone asked about the length of our tax return, he said, look, this is an issue that could be taken up as part of our white paper into tax reform. So those issues related to tax will be looked at in that context. But we're deadly serious here, Peter, about a whole of government across every portfolio trying to reduce the overall regulatory burden. We're independently costing compliance, what it means for companies in terms of the compliance that has been imposed upon them, and we will push as hard as we can to get our legislation through the Senate.
Well, let's get into some of that department by department requirements. It's coming in the shape of regulatory impact statements that are going to be required. The Prime Minister today said that this would be done by existing staff, but you said that there would be inevitably some outsourcing. So there will be outsourcing, there will be additional resources that will have to go into this, but you would obviously say it's for a greater good of ultimate reduction of costs and difficulties of doing business.
Well, I wouldn't say additional resources because departments already budget for outsourcing the preparation of regulatory impact statements where they need some expertise from outside their department.
Will you disclose, though, what the cost from the outsourcing is for these regulatory statements? Like, will that, for example, come up when you have your next day of throwing all the red tape out there? Will you give us those details on what the actual outsourcing costs of the regulatory impact statements were?
Well, those sort of issues can be dealt with for example, through a Senate estimates process, if you like, or other mechanisms. But like what I'm saying, Peter, is it's not an additional cost.
But why wouldn't you put it out? You know, throw the doors wide open and let us see what the costs of your regulatory impact statements are.
Because these are the normal costs of government, and there is nothing different in this respect to what has been done previously. But what is important is that regulatory impact statements will become mandatory as part of the Cabinet process. So where new regulations are proposed before Cabinet, they will require a regulatory impact statement. Now, a regulatory impact statement takes into account the costs of compliance. It involves consultation with stakeholders. It looks at what type of implementation steps are required, what sort of post-implementation reviews are undertaken after regulations have been enforced. You see, the problem with the previous government, Peter, was that they introduced far-reaching legislative change like the carbon tax, like the mining tax, like the changes to Fair Work, like the NBN, and these were all given prime ministerial exemptions from regulatory impact statements. We have said that will not occur under our government. We will seek to be compliant with the regulatory impact statement process, and this will make for better decision making and more transparency.
That was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Notice there with his last answer, politicians, they always know when you've asked your final question because then they just go on and on, say all the things that they wanted to say during the course of the interview that they weren't able to say, and it chews up about a minute and a half at the end. But anyway, there you go. Now,